Mach 3, give me crew show on 2, 3, and 4.
Line 1, actually 1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. Line 1.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and crew show on 7 and 9.
Line 1. Crew show 7 and 9, Mach 3.
Yeah, do something. I hate weapons.
Super Ops, line 3, red ball, avionics.
Super Ops. Line 7 is code 3 for Flickas.
Fuck.
The views expressed in this podcast are those of the individual contributors, and they don't represent any organization or entity. Okay, so today we're going to have a discussion about squadron management leadership. I guess lessons learned, what went well, what went wrong, and kind of how we can collectively come to some ideas how to make squadrons across the Air Force better. I'm joined by Kevin Traw. He was my commander in 2006. I'm also joined by David Lemery, who's currently a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force, and he was briefly my commander in 2014 when I was the acting first sergeant in the 756th Aircraft Maintenance Squadron at Luke Air Force Base. David, can you expand on your career a little bit and do an introduction, please?
Yeah, I've been in 21 years. So right now I'm at UMass Amherst enjoying the ROTC life. But probably why I got invited to this, I did 3 squadron commands. So 2 of them at Luke and then 1 at Kunsan. But just been mostly a fighter flight line guy with a little bit of, other things from time to time. But for the most part, a lot of F-16s and then a lot of F-35 stuff. And so now I'm just kind of doing an ROTC job towards the end of my career, but loved it. My dad was Air Force. My dad was a retired chief, so it's kind of the only life I've ever known is being in the Air Force, being a part of the Air Force, and wanting to serve, and following his footsteps. So definitely loved what I've done so far, and will continue doing this for as long as I can.
All right, Kevin, how about you?
Yeah, so I was on active duty from 93 to 2014, retired as a lieutenant colonel. Now working the private sector, non-defense, and I was only a squadron commander once. Started right off in an AMXS, so a little different than a number of other folks, including David, who had experience. David and I both commanded the same squadron, separated by about 6 years. Similar to David, I spent the vast majority of my time on the flight line. I left the flight line, or went to the flight line when I was a brand new first lieutenant, and never returned to the back shop. And similar to David, I worked F-16s. I was at the field level, the only aircraft I worked on.
Great. And everybody already knows me. I started out as a crew chief, and then I ended my career as an illustrious product improvement manager after destroying my career being an asshole. And that pretty much sums me up. Really what I want to have this discussion is, from the enlisted perspective, looking at the squadron commander, I think there's not a good window into what it takes to operate a squadron, all the moving pieces, and kind of where the time goes as a squadron commander. And I've heard from a few squadron commanders that there literally isn't enough time to get things done. So I really wanted to give you guys a chance to talk about, how you see a good squadron being run, some of the pitfalls that get in the way of running a good squadron. And also, if you're inclined, I know probably Kevin more so than David, just because David, you're still actively serving, maybe some colossal failures you had as a commander that you look back on and you can say, okay, I wish I hadn't have done it because of these reasons and stuff like that. But I guess we'll start with you, David. What is it? This is probably not even a good question. What does a typical day of a commander look like? Because I imagine every single day is drastically different depending on the meetings and the taskings, right?
Yeah, I mean, 2 of my squadrons were AMXS, and the other one was a CMS. So, my first squadron was 200 military and about 50 civilians. And I honestly felt like, you had a chance to get to know a lot of people in a squadron of that size, and then jumped into the 1,000-person squadron, at Luke after that. But I think in general, each airman, to me takes about 100 minutes, give or take, probably between 90 and 120 minutes of your time per year. And so if you have 1,000 people, multiply that by 100, that's just a sunk cost with EPRs and decorations and 1206s and, other things like that. And so again, that's the cost of your year just administratively. And again, I was doing it during a time without the section commander and pretty much the larger support staff that we have today. And so, yeah, I mean, your year is cyclical. I mean, when it's staff sergeant EPR time and you have 200 to do, you're just going to be tied to your computer, to some degree. But kind of what you said about airmen not knowing necessarily what the commander does, it's probably, it's up to us to tell them about it probably a little bit to help them understand. But I know even in the climate assessments, when you read a comment that says like, I've been on the flight line for a year, I haven't even seen the commander. And it's like, and it's kind of heartbreaking, but they're one of 1,000 people.
Yep.
And as much as I would love to be in coveralls, changing tires and launching jets and all that, then I'd be neglecting the other 999, to some degree. And so it sucks, and you want to be everything for everybody. And as a commander, that's something that I learned early on. Like when you first get it and you first wear the commander pin, like you want to do everything for everybody. And then you kind of got to have to learn on what you have to do and what other people can do, because they're in positions of leadership as well. And they should be serving their airmen. But, anytime any airman would come to you with, hey, I'm having an issue with finance or medical or whatever, like, you just want to solve their problems right away. But obviously your shirts and your chiefs and, everybody else who has their networks on base can do a lot of that for you.
Right.
But I know as far as time goes, we hosted General Goldfein at Kunsan when I was there in 16 to 17. And when he was going around the club there asking every commander, like, give me one nugget, I said, sir, if there was one thing I would do, I would cap the size of a squadron. And, just coming from Luke, I said I had 1,000 people and I didn't know half of them, kind of thing. And obviously he was big about wanting squadron commanders to lead their people well. And I just said, you're not going to lead everybody individually, that's for sure, when you have a squadron that big. And so that's kind of what I left them with. And I know they've made some good changes, over the years on giving commanders more authority or delegating things more to commanders, and also hopefully giving them some time to take care of themselves and their troops.
That's interesting. So maybe on 2 or 3 discussions ago, I kind of bashed commanders' calls as a waste of time a lot of the time. But I wonder if as a commander, you almost crave the commander's call, because that's one of the few times you can carve out a chance to get all of the people in a room and you can see them and you can solicit questions and you can almost directly lead them, right? Because other than that, it's just paperwork or slideshows with this person's green or red, and you don't get to see the humanity. So I wonder if commander's calls is, almost more important to the commander than the people there sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you'd love to use those to hand out awards and do all the good things as well. And obviously, you probably have a few minutes to communicate a message. But, on a flight line, it's 3 shifts. And it's really impossible to get everybody together, in any one venue, especially with a squadron that size. Even when we tried to do the squadron photo, it was like, okay, we're on the training day. It's like you're going to interrupt training day or you're going to interrupt something to get some, one of these big events done. But, yeah, I mean, it'd be great to just communicate something to everybody. And, in lieu of that, it's easy to do it through email.
Yeah.
But it's not exactly the way people want to be led, by reading their email. And then the young troops are not reading their email daily, like the more senior folks are. But yeah, it's tough to get your message across. I know, one great thing would be, I always had this dream that I'd have an airman with me, like, maybe once a week, like some random airman from a squadron, they could shadow the commander and maybe have some insight on what the commander does. And I wasn't able to do that as much as I would have liked to, but to me, that would have been something, that could have benefited that young troop to see what it was like on the other side. And if nothing else, he could communicate with his peers, a little bit. If they were saying, things about, I don't understand X, Y, or Z, then maybe that Airman Snuffy could say, well, I saw it, last Tuesday firsthand that, he or she does this and this is why they do it.
Kevin, does that kind of mirror to your experience as well?
It does. I think the only difference is when I was a commander, we still had the section commander. We still had the orderly room, the IMs, the information managers we had for part of the time that the group level. So it was a little different for me because I had the staff. The squadron 76 was 700 people at the time, so compared to 1,000, small, but compared to most squadrons at the time, still relatively large. But yeah, it pretty much mirrors. But I do believe having that support structure helps the commander be much, much more successful because your time is pulled in so many different ways. One thing I tried to do then, and I still try to do now, is protect walk around time on my calendar.
Yep.
And I found I was able to do it because, again, I think maybe I was in the ending era of a lot more command autonomy, right? And I think David a little bit alluded to, and you have also, Chris, right? So I felt I had obviously a lot of my calendar was set for me, whether it was PT, awards ceremony, fire pilot graduation, a luncheon, those things were set. But the rest of my day, I could pick how I wanted to do it. And I would, it seemed like a lot of times it was around 11 o'clock or in the middle of the day at Arizona to go out and wander to the flight line, right? And that's what it was. And that's when I went and did it, right? I hit that food shack sometimes on the way out, or I would keep like cereal and milk in my office so I could have a bowl of checks and then head out, right? Because it's really quick to eat the cereal. So I think that was very fortunate. I was, and my group commander allowed me that flexibility. I think that helped, I know that helped me quite a bit, right? I could not have imagined not having the commander support section, the section commander, and the autonomy from my group commander, I think helped me manage the schedule, which allowed me what I like to call, gave me time to have positive touches with the airmen in the squadron.
So, like, for a civilian or somebody watching an old war movie, the commander is seen as this present leader that's out with in the field, commanding the troops, walking around, and that's like the what I would envision leadership looks like. You are there, and you are taking the people, and you're saying this is what needs to be done. And it just feels like, listening to what you guys were describing, that when you become a squadron commander, it feels much less about leadership and more about time management of administrative actions, in which case it feels like the Air Force has sunk a lot of leadership, training into commanders, and then they put them in, a cubicle or a small box and have them just, sign documents and manage processes all day long. Doesn't that, I mean, this is on the outside looking in. Is that close, or am I just being pessimistic?
I mean, there's probably some truth to that. I mean, as a commander, you have your vision, here's the left and right bounds of how everybody can operate, and maneuver in, and, staying within that, everybody's good. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of processes, obviously the staff were like where we were at Luke, the chief and the MOO and some of them that sat over there, like they were running the flight line,
right?
Handling the mission, the sortie generation aspect of AMXS. I mean, we did have a CSS, but obviously it was a lot of, crew chiefs and avionics and groups that were sitting in there that were doing the best they could, but they weren't trained CSSers. Like now they actually, are beefing up those CSS, I think, staffs with more 3Fs and, and people who are professionals at that type of work. But so when I say I didn't have necessarily a CSS, it wasn't, I had one, but not like it is today, I think,
right.
Or how they're going to today. And so, but yeah, a lot of processes, and it's kind of whatever your wing or your group measures is going to get worked. And so if you're in a wing that only cares about EPR on time rates, then,
right.
More than likely you're going to get those EPRs done on time. And that's just how it goes.
So I guess part of that, in order for you to have a leadership, or in order to have like a healthy leadership climate, if you are, as a commander, if you're kind of task saturated with administrative stuff and you're trying to carve out a little bit of time for interaction leadership, that means obviously what you're doing is you're deferring/delegating the leadership piece to your chiefs, to your AMU OICs and stuff like that. So what happens if you have a toxic chief or a toxic AMU OIC? Because if you're delegating your leadership responsibility to them because you can't be everywhere all the time, what happens when you have a toxic person downstream?
So for me, knowing that you can only have those touches so much, I used to try to spend a lot of time with the chiefs and AMU ICs. The MOO, I think a lot of commanders allowed them a lot of autonomy to do their job. So that way I could try to influence the AMU OICs and the chiefs. I felt that way you could see if they were doing things that, again, not that they had to have my agreement, that they were going the right philosophy, right? And so I used to attend the daily production meeting. I was the only commander at Luke and who attended both the group daily production and the wing daily production, because I felt while that's only part of the leadership principle, in fact, I'd argue the people part is more important than the production part, because we know the production part of aircraft maintenance, especially flight maintenance, oftentimes drives either to the positive or negative interactions of the people. So I felt by being involved and at least listening with the production information. I did have to accept sometimes criticism of that. I remember my ops officer one time basically said, hey, if you've got an issue with how they're running the AMU production wise, you need to let me do it, right? As opposed to you coming down and like dropping the hammer on them, right? Because I had very strong opinions on, especially the people side of how I felt things should go. So I guess I felt, Chris, that attending those production meetings would help me identify and maybe try to prevent or circumvent a toxic chief or toxic AMUIC. Not to say it's perfect, but it is a way to get a touch with them. And then my other favorite thing is I've just wandered around was, one of the AMUs, the 308, the fact I have it out in my garage, said, they commented how I knew more about the AMU than them.
Wow.
And I'm like, well, because I just asked, right? So I would randomly, I would pop into the back of the support section, right? And almost try not to be seen by the AMU chief, because as soon as I was seen by them, right, I'd get an armed escort, right?
Yeah.
Like someone was going to walk around with me. So the longer I could preclude the armed escort, the better interaction I could have. So again, those were at least techniques I used to address what is a extremely demanding, time requirement.
So that's interesting too, David, because you talked about how you had 3 commands in a row. And, I had a commander that had a lot of commands in a row. And in my experience, which is certainly biased because I had a lot of conflicts with him, but it seems like he was almost jaded from being in command so long because, again, from the outside looking in, very often when the commander interacts with an airman, it's because the airman's in his service dress standing in his office. So it's almost akin to the only interactions you have are negative, which can really create this perception that everyone's a criminal that has just yet to be caught type of deal. And it feels like sometimes the longer you're in a command, the more kind of, pessimistic or jaded you get. Did you find yourself experiencing that at all?
I don't know if it was that. But it is definitely exhausting, for 3 in a row. And my last one was at Kunsan. So, essentially you're focused on the people in the mission there. There's no families. There's no, obviously you care about your family back in the States, but it's just a little bit different. And at least you would see the airmen at the bowling alley or, at the BX or, or somewhere else on base, because there wasn't a lot of real estate, on Kunsan, or at the Hooch, would be probably about the best place to talk to airmen. But yeah, for me, it was just exhausting, to do 3 in a row, all while trying to balance, your own health and the needs of your family. And, for me, we have special needs, being Q coded, just the needs that your family has when you're EFMP as well. And so all those things you're just trying to balance. But, I guess I never wanted to see anyone in service dress, that's for sure. But whenever I did, like, those things really weighed on me, and it definitely affected me. For every death, for every DUI, for every, you name it, those things definitely weighed on me, they just got to me. And I never liked doing them. And I know one time I had 5 Article 15s in one day that I did. And, it was probably one of the worst days of my career to ever have to do that. It was even 6 for the week, because it was kind of like Tuesdays and Thursdays were days people could come see me for those kinds of things. And it was, that's probably the worst week of my career to have to do that for the airmen who had to come see me. Obviously it wasn't a great week for them either.
Yeah.
But I know every single one of those weighed on me. And, the suicides and, deaths and things like that, all that stuff just definitely just pulls at your heart, because you don't want to see people fail. You want to see these airmen, who volunteered to serve, you want to see them succeed, whether they stay in for 4 or for, 30, whatever they choose to do, you want to see them do it to the best of their ability.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I've never written about this, but when me and David served together and I was his first sergeant, we were doing a going away for Colonel Mora. He was leaving the group and I was the MC for it. And I had my shirt phone and everything, and it started buzzing, and I saw all the commanders in the audience starting getting buzzed too. And then I stepped off, handed the mic off to somebody else, and checked my messages. And the first message was there was a service member suicide in base housing from our unit. Was the first message I got. So me and David ran across the street to security forces because it was right across the NCO club, and we kind of got better intel, which was a family member's spouse, or a spouse of a service member, had attempted suicide in base housing. And when we drove down there, it was, we didn't know what to expect, and we certainly expected the worst. When I got there, I don't think I ever told David this either, the airman was not a good airman. like he was, his uniform was always really disheveled. His hair was usually out of rags. He wasn't the best worker. He, failed PT tests. He failed his CDCs. And until I was a first sergeant, I did not give that airman much attention or respect or anything else, because I was viewing him through the lens of production, in which case he couldn't produce for me because he had all this baggage and he wasn't very good at these particular things. And then when I saw him stand outside his house where his wife had just attempted suicide, he was, I didn't see him as a bad airman. I saw him as a human being that was in, extreme emotional distress. And there's nothing I could do but just give him a big hug and let him know that everything was going to be okay and that I cared. And I think that helped, and it resonated. And that's when I realized I didn't want to be a I didn't want to be involved in the productive effort anymore, because it made me see human beings as a resource rather than see their humanity. And that type of stuff, and the airman ended up getting separated from the Air Force, I think under force shaping anyway. But we did our best to take care of him and give him lots and lots of family time to make sure that everything was stable with his wife. But those types of events, that's, to me, that's the bread and butter of the squadron leadership team. That's where it's a shame because it's like a tragedy, but that's your chance to connect and really let that person know that they matter. And I think it's just really unfortunate that so often that connection only happens after a tragedy that moves that human connection up in priority from something you want to put on your calendar that you don't really get to something you have to do because there was a suicide attempt. So I guess my hope would be that we could build those types of encounters without the catastrophe, and really just kind of try to figure out how that would happen. But circling back around kind of to the discussion, Kevin, I was really surprised that you said you were only a commander the one time.
Right.
Because, the story I wrote about us, and, we did a podcast the other day and we talked a little bit more in depth about it, but you showed a lot of humility, which to me as a new commander is even more rare, because new commanders are typically unsure, insecure of their ability to command and all that stuff. And they want to, there's probably a lot of incentivization or incentivize ego protecting sort of things, but you didn't necessarily do that. So how hard is it as a commander, but this is for both of you, to get a climate survey with negative comments about you in particular?
Yeah, for me, I felt like, hey, you got to meet people where they're at. And so I would say there was only one comment, and it wasn't the one you put, right? Because yours, I thought was, I told you we had I really liked your comment, right? Because it gave me a chance to have an interaction on a meaningful level. There was only one comment of the maybe 200 I read. And I'll be honest, I don't know how it was for David. Many of the comments were positive or neutral, right? Mm-hmm. Or, hey, this is going well. Or they were like, well, could you focus on B instead of A, right? So the number that were outright negative were probably smaller than you would maybe expect. I think there's a theory that the only people write negative stuff, and maybe some of the more impassioned ones are negative. Mm-hmm. But certainly there was only one that I thought was a little bit, like overly harsh. I'm like, I guess it's how they feel, and that's how it was. So I felt it didn't bother me. I kind of view the thought as it's not about me. It's about how the person feels. In fact, I even tell my team today, because we do similar type of climate assessment, I tell them, I believe climate assessment is how you feel about the organization. They may not necessarily reflect how you feel about individual people.
That's fair. David?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it earlier. It sucks to hear, to read your bad press kind of thing. And like I said, as a commander, if you care about the people, you want to be their commander, and, you want to lead them well. And so when some of them say they've never even, really met you at their, workstation, essentially, it sucks. And, but I know, I'm trying to get to where I need to be, during each of the days. But you're certainly not going to be there for everybody whenever they need you, but you want to. And so when you're not meeting their expectations, and, obviously they feel let down, and hopefully that doesn't make you happy, you'd want to do better on your own. But at least between the two climate assessments I had in AMXS, like between the first year and the second year, of the 12, categories, we improved in 11 of the 12 categories as far as, the percents. And I know there's probably some variability, again, whoever's responding and all that. But at least we did show improvements. So I was happy about that. And then the one was neutral. But even if you read about something, maybe it's not necessarily bad about you, but something they're not happy with down at the AMU level that you just don't even know about,
Right.
then that's as well, because you wish communication was better, or you wish you just knew about what was going on, or that somebody was harassed or discriminated against, or
Yeah.
if there was that toxic senior NCO or CGO, and you didn't know about it, then again, that you feel like you failed because you missed an opportunity to correct something. Because, those young A1Cs, they're out there working just so incredibly hard. And then if someone's treating them bad, at the back end or the front end of their day, then, that's not going to make them want to stay and serve their country.
Yep. So, I remember, Kevin, I'm 99% sure it was you. It was after I did the climate assessment survey conversation with you, and you started hosting more and more commanders calls and, asking me questions. I think there was a time that sheet metal was not staying late for us, or metals tech was not staying late for us. And we elevated it to you in commanders call. And it was basically, hey, we're working 12s because metals tech or sheet metal is not staying late. And your response was, if it's a flyer and they're not there, you can call me at home and I will call up all the people I need to call up until you get the support you need so you can get the mission done. And that kind of goes back to the conversation or what David had said, where sometimes it's about not you as a commander, it's about things that just aren't on your radar that
Right.
aren't meeting your people's needs. And that's a great way to directly communicate. And a lot, it's hard to raise your hand at a commander's call and say something's fucked up or it's broken. It's a lot easier to put it in an anonymous climate survey and kind of send it into the void, and your commander kind of picks it up and runs with it. But I guess also my question is, especially you, David, because you were a commander right after the force reduction. You were commander in the force reduction time. It's got to be hard because probably I would imagine a lot of those climate surveys comments were very related to being under resourced to get the mission done, and going back to what Kevin said, when he's sitting in for the production meeting at the group and the wing, what he's doing is he's getting an indirect pulse of the happiness or the morale of his unit, because if he can see bad production calls being made, not enough resources to get the sorties done, ops tempo is really high, you can infer that your people are going to end up being miserable. So if you can address the production issues, you might be able to make your people happy vicariously. So how hard was it, or did you see any, feedback in your climate assessment surveys or any informal feedback of, that left you feeling like you were paralyzed because the issues went far beyond the scope you had control over?
I mean, I think what I would see a lot is airmen who would put comments in there about, I don't know why I was working this job and then I got moved to this job, and so it was always like, I need to ensure that our pro supers and expediters and, CGOs are communicating the why. We're not in the middle of a war. I think we have time to communicate the why. Like, we're taking this jet off the schedule and putting this one on the schedule because of this, for whatever the reason is. So, that was definitely a big thing of like, we got to really do good, about communicating the why behind what we're doing. It's not just because I hate you and I want you to work harder, as an airman. It's hopefully a reason behind what we're doing. Maybe I need a D model instead of a C model. And here's why, because I need to get this young lieutenant who's trying to get his upgrade done or whatever. So certainly I don't expect, everyone in the squadron to understand like, how all that works and how the operators are getting upgraded. But I think we should try and do a better job of explaining it to them. But like Kevin, I mean, I'd go to the production meeting with the group every day. I certainly couldn't go to all 6 AMU's production, but I'd go to the group production meeting so that if something came up, at least I'd have a pulse of what's going on there. And I didn't always go to the wing one, but if something was going bad in one of the AMUs, then I'd be at the wing, production meeting in the afternoon, so that if someone was going to get beat up, hopefully it'd be me and not the AMU OIC, getting beat up from the wing commander. But one thing that maintenance officers, it's good and bad. They get a lot of face time with the wing commander. If they're doing a great job, it's a great thing, because you might end up with CGO of the year, or some award, or get a school push or something out of it. But if your AMU is struggling, and it's also a lot of face time with the wing commander as well.
So, I'm not sure how good of a maintenance officer you'd have to be to offset like a resource starvation type of, you know what I mean? Like Like there was I know of one officer, they went over to Korea and they were very good, and they got put in charge of the worst unit because they were really hoping that this person could, you know, work their magic and turn it around. But, you know, if you don't have the tools, there's nothing that can be done there, and you're just going to get, you know, ground up and beat yourself up because you couldn't turn something around. So what was it like being a commander in the middle of force reduction where ops tempo stayed high and manpower, and more importantly, experienced manpower, was cut?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely lost some experience, and I know, you know, they were doing those DOS rollbacks and some of those things in probably 13, 14
Mm-hmm.
time frame. And, you know, and I know you saw it, like the guys and gals who are out there doing the work all the time, they're the ones who could potentially bend metal and get in trouble for it. But if those are the ones who are always out there doing the work, you know, it's kind of hard to punish them, you know, when there's others who sit in the background potentially, and they're never going to get in trouble because they didn't, you know,
risk.
There's no risk there. And so hopefully you balance that. But, you know, taking over, you know, an AMXS, you know, if those Article 15s had been done in the years prior, you know, any of that past time frame, then they might have had a negative indicator that just kind of auto forced them out in the 2013-14 timeframe. I know one of my egress troops in CMS, you know, had an Article 15 for, you know, tool accountability essentially when I took over command of CMS there. And then so DOS rollback hit, experienced 7-level egress troop, you know, and so I actually wrote a letter to the board and like said, please don't separate this guy. You know, he's a quality troop. He made that one mistake, you know, and it sucked. But I think we should retain him, and he still got cut. You know, it was just kind of a, hey, you know, it was kind of just a blanket thing, you know, and you felt like it wasn't that personal connection to the airmen. But so I know we lost a lot of our 7 levels and in a lot of the 2 alpha career fields.
And, you know,
might have had the one mistake. But.
Yeah. And I applied for early retirement too, because I was at 15 and I was like, I'm going to punch. I'm sick of this shit. And that was back when the way the policy memo read was if you were, because of these certain criteria, if you were vulnerable to the disciplinary, the board, basically the bad people board, I can't remember what it's called. Sorry. And you applied for early separation or early retirement, it would be automatically approved because basically like, oh, you're a bad seat anyway. We don't have to figure it out. You're just going to get out. So I applied for early retirement because my record was spotless. They were like, no, you don't get to early retire. So I really regretted not like taking a dump on, you know, like somewhere or race my car down the runway and get an Article 15 or something, which it was really a kind of a backwards sort of, I mean, I guess they were trying to just keep the best of the best. But the problem is the discriminators they were using was sometimes unrelated to work ethic and leadership, right? Because you can't, how do you quantify work ethic and leadership? You know, normally you do that through EPRs, but at the time our EPRs were all farcical sort of inflated sort of things where you couldn't peel out who was good and who was bad. So I also want to kind of shift gears. So when I was going through my issues at Holloman with a commander that I thought was heavy-handed in the application of discipline and punishment, I reached out to Kevin specifically to get his take on it. And he told me something that I would like to think a lot of commanders think and feel, but I'm not sure. He told me, Chris, I'd rather let 99 criminals go free than punish one innocent person. And he said, because if someone's a criminal, I'll find out. If I don't have all the proof I need, I'll keep an eye on them and they'll screw up again and I'll catch them. Is that a typical sort of mindset, especially in aircraft maintenance where the stakes are kind of high?
So for me, you know, again, you and I had talked about that, and I do feel strongly that if someone has recurring issues, that they will pop back up, right? And it was very interesting. One of the squadron commanders, the pilot spider squadron commanders, asked me. He actually said, "How do you know when it's time to separate someone?" Discipline. I said, "When I no longer feel safe about putting you in a jet they've worked on." Right, which actually brought him a lot of relief, right? So when I said that, now you could argue that it's based on us knowing if we've reached that situation, right? And there's a lot of, you know, it's the work, not only is it the pilot, but there's the people working on the airplane. You can be risking their lives too if we make a bad decision. But again, I still feel it's better to, you know, is if you incorrectly punish someone who didn't do something wrong, it filters across the whole force, right? Likewise, and I think, Chris, you may or may not remember, we had one of the lieutenants get an ARC 15 in our squadron, which was highly unusual, right? And I remember there was people said, should you really have her get the ARC 15? I said, she was an E4, would she get an ARC 15? They said, yes. I said, so she's in, I said, her is an O2. I said, should be held to a higher standard, right? In fact, on newcomers presentations, I used to say that in my hierarchy, I'm going to hold officers and senior NCOs the highest, NCOs next, and as the airmen the least, right? And of course, people would kind of always, cynical, right? They'd be in there and hear me say that, and they go, yeah, he's not going to do that. And then oftentimes they'd come out and they'd say, yeah, I found out many of the AMUs had the base paper where this lieutenant had her, they don't put the names, right? But they put what happened. And they said, in this squadron, he means it, right? And it's very funny on that when, I think putting the people in the base paper is negative, right? I actually don't like that method. But they actually called me, legal called and said, do you want to put hers in there? I said, do we put the airmen in there?
Yeah.
I said, yes. I said, then hers is going in there. They said, well, you have 200 airmen and you only have 4 lieutenants. I said, I'm not going to have a different responsibility, right? So I really do think that, Chris, the not punishing innocent people just because you're worried about a guilty person getting away and being fair-handed will, in general, make for a successful, call it disciplinary environment, right?
David?
Yeah, I mean, it's an art, not a science. I mean, and if I could go back and see every piece of paper I ever issued, I may have adjusted up or down here or there. But I know in general, it's like, let's start at the lowest level. There would be times maybe a section chief or somebody would say, they'd break like, you got to Article 15 this guy, and I'm like, what have you ever, what have we ever done to help this person, grow as an airman? Did they have what kind of background did they have? Maybe they've never even learned from a stable parent, and guess what, master sergeant, whoever, you're this person's dad or mom now, kind of thing as a section chief. And I know you experience that obviously in your roles, in AMUs and stuff, but it's like, let's do everything we can to try and give this person a chance to succeed. They've raised their right hand and agreed to, die for their country. So the least we can do is try and give them some tools to succeed. Now, again, at some point, like Kevin said, like safety is the most important thing we're going to do out there on the flight line. And if this person can't keep these pilots safe or can't keep their, coworkers safe based on their actions, and they probably shouldn't be out there turning wrenches, and they, maybe should be separated. Maybe they never wanted to get into maintenance in the first place. Maybe they would have been an outstanding, some other career field. But the fact that they were in maintenance, we do need to hold them to, I think, that high standard of that safety is the most important thing. And so, like Kevin said, if I couldn't trust that they could do their job safely, then, that was kind of my threshold of, we got to do something about that.
So, Kevin, you kind of mentioned, I think it was you that you mentioned offline that your stance on punishment and discipline had actually softened since you were a commander, since you retired. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah. So I felt that I think this, a little bit of the normal aging process that kind of David alluded to, some you do up and down. I felt that there's a few I liked some takebacks, right? And it was around, we had a much smaller force shaping. We had some people that were force shaped out that, particularly I wish I would have maybe done something different when that disciplinary came up that wouldn't have forced the auto force shaping. I mean, Chris, you may argue that, hey, you didn't know that was going to come, and it's not really fair for you to say you make different decisions knowing what the future is going to hold. But,
no, but I think it chills you later on, because after you've seen a force shaping indiscriminate target at somebody, then after the force shaping ebb and flow kind of passes, you're like, maybe this isn't an Article 15, because I don't know if in 8 years this guy's going to get booted again.
Right. Yeah, and that's definitely part of it. So I definitely think that I probably would have, I was so focused on being consistent, which of course created a positivity in itself, right? That consistency sometimes would drive me to not make an individual decision, because I had such a strong desire to be consistent, right? And I wish I would have used a little more discretion. The flip side, though, I would have legitimately been open to accurate criticism that are you playing favorites, right?
Right.
And it actually wouldn't have been that, but it was trying to handle each one a little more individually. So that's kind of a summary, Chris. I'd say when I say I would be softened, I think what it would have been, I would have been purposely less consistent when I had really tried to be very consistent. I thought, hey, large organization consistency is the key to a successful organization. I think that's why I would have varied in that purposeful inconsistency when I felt was more appropriate.
Yeah, and that's a pretty legitimate point, because very often, especially when, it's something on the Air Force Times or whatever, I think recently there was a E9 that was convicted of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the last 2 or 3 days or something, and they I think they had a line number E9 and it got killed, and they're just going to separate or retire or whatever. And from the outside looking in, it's very much a, hey, what the hell's going on here? Like, that was sexual assault, sexual harassment. But I'm certainly not speaking for that case, but sometimes there are absolutely extenuating circumstances where the heavy-handed punishment isn't necessary. So you tailor the punishment to the individual. Then all the people that got heavier punishment for the last 3 years look at it and go, hey, they did the same thing I did, and I didn't, and they got an LOR and I got an Article 15 with 15 days extra duty.
Yeah, I could acknowledge if I could rerun it, and let's say I was purposely more inconsistent, that I could be here 15 years later telling you, geez, Chris, I wish I would have been more consistent.
Right.
I mean, I will acknowledge that, right? I think with age, understanding that you can't rerun it, but I could, again, that was overriding principle. You have to definitely do that. I will tell you, I had, one incident where we had an airman in the 310th get a DUI, and he told me he had one drink. I absolutely believed him, and I actually did a deferral on his discipline. Now, because I'd been so consistent, at the wing level, they didn't give me any grief, right? I will tell you. And so maybe I could say, geez, because I was so consistent, that time I really wanted to pull this card that I'm going to defer the disciplinary action, that I was able to do that, right? So again, it's easy to, Monday morning quarterback myself, right? But understanding that being consistent let me do what I felt was appropriate. I still feel on that case, it was appropriate, right? And it was the security, because he'd gotten it on base, right? So they wanted to drop the hammer, and they all thought it'd be an easy kill with me, right? And I'm like, because flight line maintenance squadron commander, I'm like, no, I believe the kid, and I believe him to this day. That was what it was. So I feel very comfortable in that decision.
So, Kevin, you're in a leadership position now in the civilian sector, but either you or David, do you miss being a commander?
I mean, I'm still I'm a detachment. I'm a G series commander now, just obviously of a lot smaller, organization. There's just 5 of us in the military here at UMass, so it's much, much different. And then you're not G series over the cadets. They'll fall under a different set of rules. But so it's still a commander, just with a lot fewer people. But
yeah, I didn't mean to slight your authority and your power right now.
Honestly, there's some guys and gals who say I would do command for my whole career, and I think they're nuts. Honestly, it's a great thing to do, but I wouldn't want to do it forever. So it's, it's one of those, you just know it's going to be a kind of a marathon sprint.
Yep.
But at some point there needs to be a finish line, if you at all value your own health or your family time and, those kinds of things. So glad I did it. I can't say I necessarily miss it. I do miss, just the camaraderie on the flight line and, JP8 and some of that other stuff of being in a Phoenix organization. But I did it, and it wouldn't be the same if I went back. Just like any job, any of those special duties or things that I've done in the past, as much as it would probably say oh, it'd be awesome to do it again, but it wouldn't be the same as when you did it last time.
That's fair.
And you would just be comparing it, saying it's not like it was, or because you only know the one other style. So.
Yeah. Kevin?
Yeah, I feel exactly the same, right? I mean, in fact, I think in terms of being on the flight line, I mean, it was certainly an honor to be an AMXS commander, but being the ops officer was awesome, because you got all of the fun of being on the flight line without having to do the command aspect of the job, which is critical. So I absolutely miss that. What I have found is, I think, Chris, you and I talked about this. And I'm going to not paraphrase, but you almost said, do you miss having those tools, right? It's not quite how you said it, but and I found that in the private sector, you have to be a little bit more creative, right? Which I think I was fairly creative in the Air Force on disciplinary actions, right? In the course of the private sector, you have none of those tools. The flip side, though, is you certainly have the power of separation in the military environment. In the private sector, you have the power of firing, right? So it's almost like the tool set's different, right? I mean, in the military, you really kind of have the G series orders, and even without those, supervisors and enlisted officer have a lot of legal authority, right? Where in the private sector, there's a lot of influence authority. The one key difference is, I think you and I actually texted on this probably 6, 7, 8 months ago, right? On that, in the military, I have no direct say in people's pay.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, of course, if you give someone a bad rating on EPR, you certainly have say. But we all know how, well, at least when I was in, how the system was, right? 5s were pretty much the rule. So, you know, in the private sector, I have a huge influence directly on their pay, their bonus, and promotions, right? So in some ways, if you want to be, you can almost be more dastardly, right? In the private sector, which is a little bit different. But yeah, I don't miss the trappings of command. I miss the maintenance aspect of command.
Interesting. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about first sergeants, because I think obviously first sergeants is kind of an integral part of squadron leadership. And when I joined in 1998, my first sergeant was Sergeant Terry Gerald, who was, man, he really shamed every other first sergeant I had thereafter. He was the driver of what made me want to be a first sergeant. He knew everyone's name. He knew everyone's spouse's names. And we were in the 310th doing night flying. I have a storm coming through too, so if I disconnect, is the same one there?
It's getting dark here too. So.
Okay. All right. Well,
it's sunny in California, so we're good.
Yeah. But he was in the unit probably at least every other day at 7:30 at night during swing shift roll call, like as we were sitting down getting ready to start the day. And he was very, very visible, and kind of goes back to what you were talking about, Kevin, where you would go to the production meeting. When I was doing acting first sergeant in the 756 for David, I would always go to the weekly staff meeting in the AMU, because that's where I'm going to get a bunch of information on whose EPRs are due, who has PT profiles. Let's have conversations about, you know, what's going on with these kids, CDC failures and stuff like that, and just to be visible. You know, if I was going to be in the 756 long term under you, Dave, I would have definitely asked for an office down in the unit. I would have probably expected to be there, stationed there, and only come to you for administrative stuff was my vision. But it seems that, you know, so going back to Terry in 1998, the buck stopped with him as an enlisted person. I knew that if I got in trouble, I didn't necessarily fear the commander. I 100% feared my first sergeant, who I loved dearly too, because as long as you were a good airman, I mean, he invited me over to his house for Thanksgiving, and, you know, you just didn't want to disappoint him. But it seems that there has been a shift in the authority of a first sergeant and the role of a first sergeant from what I experienced in 1998. It might have been that Terry was just a rare outlier, and his commander gave him a lot of latitude, to what first sergeants, you know, in me included, when I worked for David, it felt like we were much more facilitators of just administrative processes than the enlisted advisor for the enlisted force in that unit. I mean, do you feel that first sergeants are still the enlisted advisors, or are they just the assistant to the commander now? David, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I know after you left, I think the 3 first sergeants who were there, I know they tried to set up shop more down in the AMU. So, you know, the thing you were thinking about was happening there. And then at Kunsan, you know, same thing. The first sergeants were mostly down in the AMUs. You know, they could certainly ghost up in the AMXS building, but I definitely would be interested to see, like, I forgot the first sergeant AFI, but the one, you know, if there was one in 1998, you know, what were the roles and responsibilities and compared to, you know, what it is now. But I know if the enlisted troops, you would have never punished them, but hopefully they would have felt bad disappointing you. You know, you mentioned that too. You didn't want to disappoint, you know, your first sergeant, but I guess I didn't really expect y'all to be the bad cop. if anything, like your job is just to take care of them in every possible way. And if it had to be a bad cop type action, I guess my thought was that it would come from me.
Hmm.
But maybe, that's could have ebbed and flowed over time on how we do things. And maybe I did it unique or, I don't know, but I just know, like, if anything, like I said, you guys were rocks and great examples of what the airmen should be. And so if they didn't live up to those expectations, hopefully they, would feel that disappointment, but certainly you weren't going to be the one to administer the 15.
Right. And when I talked to Terry, he'd be like, I would do everything up to including an Article 15. And then when I needed the commander's authority, I would pop into his office and say, sir, I need you to, we have to thump this guy with an Article 15. And that would happen that way. But it also makes me think, I think, I don't know if it was you. Were you the commander when we got the 2 DUIs in one weekend when I was a shirt?
I mean, more than likely. The phone was ringing. There were like 3.5 to 4 of you first sergeants in that squadron, kind of thing. And so more than likely the phone was going to ring at some point. It was just one of those, like, that ringtone. Honestly, on my iPhone now, I can't use the ringtone that I had. Like, it's like a PTSD kind of thing. And even if I hear it, if someone else is in a building and I hear that ringtone that I just happen to have for my time, it's probably the default one on an iPhone. Like, when I hear it, it makes my heart race. It still, like, causes, because, most of the time you guys weren't calling just to say, like, hey, how's it going? Are you having a good day? Kind of
Never.
I hated weekends, by the way. I always wanted money I hated weekends. 4-day weekends were the worst.
But, I also know, like, you guys were the ones, you're going to get the call first from security forces or somebody, like, even, 2, 3 a.m. or command post or whatever. I mean, you guys were that filter, and you guys were great about knowing, like, is this just a text? Is this an email? Or is this a phone call?
Right.
I could at least set the settings on my iPhone to kind of filter as needed. But so you guys knew if it was very important, like, it's going to be a call and the phone's going to ring, and my wife would know, like, if I leave, if I'm out shaving and putting on my uniform, then, something probably big is going down. But if it was just more like, hey, this happened at 2 a.m., we can deal with it tomorrow, then you guys would, just maybe an easy email kind of stuff. But so I definitely appreciated the filter. I couldn't have done, what I did without you guys being, the filter between.
So I asked that because I wonder, how often would you pull your first sergeant? This is really for both you two. How often would you pull your first sergeant aside when there was a habitual problem in the enlisted force and go, hey, what are you doing with this? Like, would you hold your first sergeant responsible for the behavior of the enlisted force?
I know I didn't, and again, I probably could have, or at least probably directed more, like, first sergeant, go teach, go lead, go do more, personal interaction, with the troops. But I know, I guess, just in the chaos of an AMXS, that it didn't necessarily cross my mind to direct that more. I know you guys were doing that, you guys were doing some of that on your own, but I didn't see anything that just warranted, like, you guys need to be down here. I want that to be your only focus, is, going out and doing, lunch and learns or whatever it is you can do. But I don't know, definitely probably something I should have thought about more.
Kevin?
Yeah, probably. I wish, the same as David, that, would have had them go out and spend more time. I certainly would ask them to advise the AMUIC, the chiefs, tried to give them some ideas to try to, because again, I think that, as a commander, you have different, you get, as you kind of alluded earlier, you kind of get trained in experience, and where, the chiefs obviously had more time in the Air Force than me, but their experience are different. Of course, the AMUICs did not, and I really felt the first sergeant could kind of influence them, right, to kind of talk about things. And also the thing is that he could also run interference, right? And he's like, hey, if you bring this to the commander, he's going to ask you, have you done this, right? So he could definitely advise them from, making what would be a not well thought out decision, right? Because I understand when they're down there in the AMU, they're like thinking, okay, I just need to get this off my plate, and then I can get on to the next thing, right? They weren't necessarily thinking, I think at least successful commanders are trying to think down the road. And I think the AMUICs and chiefs oftentimes are trying to think, what can I do the next 2 hours to get through the day or the night? And I think that shirt could really kind of advise them to try to help them think things through that maybe I was more apt to think through as opposed to them.
Right. So, because, what I would envision is, when we really talked about at the beginning of this conversation, how time management's a struggle and there's not enough time in the day and there's a lot of administrative tasks, I wonder if the shirts get wrapped up in that, because you're indirectly or subconsciously offloading administrative stuff to the shirt to try to, help free up your time. And at the same time, what you're doing is you're hamstringing their ability to be the enlisted leader, to go out and do those things, where it's just basically everybody's chasing these impossible to meet administrative requirements, which hampers almost leadership universally throughout the units. But I'll tell you what, I was, David will argue this, but I was probably a failure because when we got those 2 DUIs, it never crossed my mind that was my responsibility. It seems because here's the deal: if there's 2 DUIs in your unit, David and Kevin, you're going to have to answer to the group or the wing what the fuck's going on in your unit, right? So you're responsible for their behavior, and I really feel like the shirt should also be equally or greater responsible for that behavior because they are the enlisted. I know that the AMXS chief and all that stuff, they're the leader, but really the shirt is the person that's the enlisted commander, and they're supposed to just run with the entire enlisted force, get them what they need, keep them accountable, let them know, what's, enforce standards and stuff like that. And, I'm not sure I was doing that. I mean, in fairness, I was an acting first sergeant. I'd never been to first sergeant school, and I kind of just, jumped in the seat, but those are my lined up excuses. But I think the reality is, I think our first sergeants, as I view them now, are not used as they were originally intended and not used up to their full potential. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that everyone's task saturated at the squadron level, and leadership becomes a rare commodity that's very costly to kind of implement.
I think because AMXS is, we had one for each AMU, I think that gave us a huge advantage, which I we'll see what David thinks, right? I think that maybe over CMS or EMS, right, where I could, the shirts could divide and conquer, right? So they could spend more time out in the AMUs, right? So maybe those administrative tasks, like someone had to go to legal or MPF, right? So, the 63rd AMU shirt would go there and the other 2 could be out in the AMUs, right? So I always felt that because we had multiple, and I usually had 2 shirts and 1 acting, though one of my acting shirts was in the role for over a year,
right?
So I felt that gave us a huge advantage to try to, at least if the commander wanted to use the shirts as they're intended, because we had multiple shirts, we could do that, right? It was up to us, right? Because I had 3, and if I wanted to just have them do administrative tasks all day, that was kind of my bad. So I felt that gave us a huge advantage, that we were able to use them closer to their intended reason within the constraints of the mass amounts of paperwork we had to do.
Yeah, I mean, I know the shirts were doing obviously you had to do a quality check on all the EPRs. I certainly didn't want to see a firewall 5 where the guy had just gotten the work kind of thing. So you guys were doing that as far as admin tasks and also running the awards program. Quarterly and annual awards were, and I think that's just how it was when I got to AMXS. And so could I have dumped that on somebody else? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but it's hard to mess with something that's working, right?
Yeah. So, right. But I know that, that can be a big burden, every quarter, and then the annuals, when they're all coming due, and the shirts were running that program as well. But yeah, I mean, we had multiple shirts, and, I think, but basically, you were always going to the med group or going to security forces or going to see somebody to help some airman with something. So it's not like there was that much idle time. I guess I'd be curious to see what they're teaching down at Gunner. That they had the first sergeant school. So I'm not sure what if the schoolhouse is pushing more like enlisted leadership, go make airmen better, or just to be more reactionary.
Right. Sure. And that's a good point. I was thinking that too. It definitely felt like my time in the seat, although limited, was almost purely reactionary, which really is that strike. Anytime you're in the military and you're reactionary, be it in production, you're reactionary, be it you're an OIC and you're reacting, like that's not the position you want to be in ever. That's a emergency stopgap until you can figure out a plan, and now you can proactively prevent these things and head off stuff and increase productivity. But I didn't have the wherewithal as a shirt to think I need to build something proactive. I need to develop my enlisted force. And it very well could be that I was an outlier, and that's a distinct possibility. But, in my experience, it feels like a lot of shirts are very reactionary. But that may not be necessarily their fault. It's just kind of the hand they're dealt.
But I think it's good if, like you said, if you could just sit down in the AMU, then you just have that much more time around the troops. And if you saw that airman who consistently had bad haircut or bad uniform, you could certainly hopefully see that on day 1 or 2 versus day 100 when they're finally coming to see the commander.
Yeah, that's fair.
Kind of thing. And so if that's I was happy to have 3 assigned first 3 master sergeants, and EMS, which was a monstrous squadron, had 1 senior.
Yeah, with like a tech undershirt or whatever.
Yes, I would have taken 3 masters over 1 senior any day, just
just because of manpower. Yeah,
I to conquer, but that squadron was a beast. Which also had ammo, so they just had a lot of personnel for only 1 person or 1.5 shirts. But I was definitely happy to have 3 dedicated ones, and then we had a tech sergeant helping out as well after you were gone.
Yeah. So I guess is there this question is probably more directed at you, David, because you're still in the military and you've been in the commander seat. Well, still, again, I'm not.
Yeah, good on you, Chris, on catching that one.
But what types of changes? I mean, you talked about when you talked to General Goldfein that it's you needed more time and you needed more time management. Is there any tangible suggestions or maybe a program or something that could get taken off your plate that would help?
I mean, I've seen some other positive changes, like even PRS have changed from 9 lines to 2, so some of that admin burden. There's no more EPR, right, for the first term airman or the first, first.
Up to 36 months or something like that?
So that alone would have freed me up, 100, man hours or whatever, kind of thing throughout my time as a commander. And so some of those other things have been, I think, positive changes, just admin wise, personnel wise. That again, anything you can take off the commander's plate gives that commander more time to just go walk the flight line and just grab a radio or a golf cart and just see what you can go out and and do for the day. So I've seen a lot of those positive changes. There's probably some things that other people could do more for you. I know, we're a geographically separated unit, and one of the things the host base said, like, hey, you need to appoint a unit voting rep. And I'm like, I really need a unit voting rep for 4 people? Can't you just handle that, at the FSS at my host base kind of thing? And so, just maybe people don't even think about some of those things. So, if you can push back and potentially consolidate things, within some other organization, and there's probably more synergistic things that can be done across the Air Force. I've been, again, from the Pentagon 2 years, and then I've been here for a year. So I've been off the flight line for the past 3 years and out of the CSS, standard kind of command role. So not as in tune as how exactly things are going these days. But from what I've been reading, it sounds like there's been some positive changes to how commanders are being supported going forward, to include, maybe a section commander. I think people are earning section commanders. It was even one of the things that I tried to get the MOO to be able to sign. I think it was staff and below EPRs. Yep. And I think when
they flipped out.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah. And the FSS flipped out, and,
because you basically had like 2 concurrent G series orders for the same thing at the same time. And they're like, yeah, you can't do that. Right.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Right. I was commanding the 56 and the 756.
That's right.
And that created a black hole within the FSS as well. And they were imploding on themselves, saying, you can't command 2 squadrons at the same time. And I'm like, hey, this was the cards I've been dealt, and I'm going to play them.
I remember that because I had to get your G series orders fast tracked through the group commander at the time, because you couldn't sign. I think you had like an Article 15 coming up for a kid in the 56, and you didn't have 56 G series orders. So I had to like expedite getting it done. I remember that.
Right. And then just in VPC, like, we can't assign you multiple passcodes, for multiple commands. And I'm like, but I'm the commander of both, and I need these passcodes assigned to me in VPC and like, you name it.
Yeah.
It's all kind of tied to what they think you do. And so it's hard to convince, the FSS that, no kidding, I'm the commander of both.
So this next question, I'm going to start with Kevin, just because he's a little bit further removed. So he's probably going to feel a little bit more capable to talk. Did you ever see a commander that shouldn't be a commander that was still a commander, Kevin?
Yeah, I did. I did see that. Maybe it's a rote answer. Like, I felt, not that I necessarily lived up to everything a commander should be, but I always felt I tried, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was, I used to kind of say that if I look at myself in the mirror, do I deserve to still be doing this role, right? And I kind of use that. And so I felt that, especially in aircraft maintenance, because of the few number of FGOs, like you talked about David commanding 3 times. It's a matter of necessity as opposed to like what's good management of the force. So yeah, I do feel that there was a number of commanders that I was around and knew and served with as commanders who probably shouldn't have been there. I would also argue on a broader one, I'll stay with the commander piece, that to this day, I'm still mystified that, if someone graduates from a distinguished graduate at SOS, somehow they're good to go to 06, right? Certainly I understand a large organization, you have to have legitimate discriminators, but if I view, and I do think the Air Force views Squadron Command as the cornerstone of the Air Force, then you should use that as another cut down. You may have been on the golden path, but if you aren't successful as a commander, you
then
can
you're
say
off,
thank you.
You're off the
You're
golden
off.
path.
You're off the golden path, right? And I really felt that that should be how that's done, right? So I felt there was even some people saw there was other commanders to serve with who should be taken off that path, but because they had something, they were
There's no
inspired
choice.
for someone. There's no choice. They kind of just kept going, right? And I think that's unfortunate for the organization as the Air Force, right? So definitely, I do think that they should be more selective in their command, should try to have appropriate manpower to not place everyone in command who shouldn't be there. And then if someone is not successful as a command, don't push them to the next command.
Yeah, so I'm glad you said that, because that's a lot of things that I perceive, and I'm very self-conscious because I had some adverse experiences with commanders that I truly believe my perception of commanders has been tainted by it. But there's a couple points that you touched on that I want to circle back to. First of all, when you're resource starved for maintenance officers in these command billets, your standard is you can't set a good standard, because it's just like promotion to E6 for enlisted folks. They're going to promote the top 30%. And if the top 25% are great and the next 5% are amoral morons, it doesn't matter, because they're still going to become tech sergeants. And I feel like it's the same, algebra for squadron command. It's, hey, we have X amount of slots. These are the top people. That's not enough to fill the slots. Let's go to the next list of people that may not be ready, but we it's better to have this person in the slot than no one in the slot, and that's what we're kind of left with. But what seems to me, and obviously I had some interactions with the command climate, and I, engaged in some whistleblowing sort of activities. What really surprised me was that I felt that I was exposing someone that was unfit for command, and it felt like the commanders and or his commander circled the wagons type of deal. So it's from the outside looking in, it seems like once someone's anointed to be a commander, that their judgment is assumed noble, and the burden is on other people to prove that they're behaving in a unethical way.
Yeah, and again, probably maybe easier for me to talk this than David, given his position. So actually, I think it's incumbent upon the other commanders to hold the other commanders responsible, right? And I had to do one congressional inquiry when it was near the very, very end of my tenure at the 756 about a decision another commander had made, and I pulled out the AFIs. I actually interviewed the person who made the, I guess that reputation of being consistent helped, because he was another squadron. I said, do you mind if I ask you? And he gave me through, and I wrote that I believe that the commander had made an improper decision. Right now, obviously it was congressional, so it wasn't a legal matter for the Air Force, right? But I wrote that in there, right? And to my leaders' credit, they didn't try to dissuade me, right? They let me submit it. They said, well, we asked you to write it, so I guess we've got to be okay with what you say, right? Similarly, I sat on a court martial, and I guess the 1 out of 100 that's found not guilty, I was the president of that court martial. Found the person not guilty, right? And it was very interesting. Actually, Chris, you may not have known, David probably knows it wasn't unusual for commanders to have very good relationship with the JAG, but I also tried to make a good relationship with the Area Defense Council.
Oh, wow. That's
too.
wild.
And I would meet with the Area Defense Council probably once a month. And I remember after the fact, I talked to the ADC and the JAG about it. And the Area Defense Council told their co-counsel, they said, hey, we'll put Major Tron. They said, we believe our person is not going to be convicted. And we think we can convince him if the data is there to say not guilty. But the ADC told the visiting agency, he said, however, if they find him guilty, he said he will absolutely throw the book at him, right? He said he will argue for the harshest punishment, probably more than the other candidate. So it was very unusual for a AMXS commander to be a court martial, because they always would try to toss us, right? But they felt that impartiality. So again, my experience was that the command climate I had with the fellow commanders, at least at Luke when I was there, they would allow the commanders latitude to do what they thought was right, which I think makes all the difference in the world, and holding each other accountable.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, in those two cases, certainly the court martial, the commander hadn't put the person up incorrectly, right? I mean, I'm sure the person was guilty, but you have to have evidence, right? There's no doubt the person was guilty, but there was no evidence. Therefore, they're not guilty in America, right? So yeah, that's how I think it should be handled, and hold each other accountable.
I got retained on a court martial as well. That, you know, kind of surprised me, but I also tried to have a relationship with the ADC but AMXS commander, and got popped for jury duty and went, you know, and I was surprised, you know, but again, I think having some credibility with the ADC helped me not get kicked off, because obviously the prosecution would love to have me. You know,
absolutely. A fly-like commander they love.
I wasn't the president, you know, there was a colonel in ours, but yeah, I was, you know, I got retained, but you know, again, it's just, again, like you said, having those relationships matter, whether it's your command peers or, you know, across the base, those relationships matter.
Okay. Well, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. Do you guys have any final thoughts or any words of wisdom you want to pass along?
I mean, even just like what I'm telling my cadets now, like if you just do two things in life, just try and care, you know, not try to care, try and care. And if you do those two things, you know, you're probably going to be okay. But yeah, don't forget, you know, at the end of the day, that the airmen are out there doing some of the hardest work, you know, in our military, and it's our job as, you know, leaders to take care of them. You know, again, you only have so much time in the day, and you're going to miss some things. And when you look back on your career, you're going to potentially wish you did one or two things, you know, or many things, you know, a little bit different, whether it's positive or negative. But if you just continue to be that person who they can at least believe is a consistent leader who's going to continue to try and continue to care for them, then hopefully they'll give you their best. And, you know, at the end of the day, just getting them across to a successful enlistment or to a successful career and see them retire is, you know, those are some of the best things in the world. Yeah.
I think for me, people should view command as it's a privilege to lead. It's not a privilege to be in charge, right? Is how I look at it. It's a privilege to lead, and that you should always put the airman as the forefront in your command, because now years down the road, you remember the people, right? And I think you miss out on a huge opportunity if you don't put the people foremost. And I remember at the commander school, they said it's not about you, it's about your people. And I tried to take that to heart. So truly, you know, is a privilege to be command. It was the best 2 years of my career, and I do miss it, right? Even though you know, I've been happy, and the time is right to be in the private sector. But yeah, that's my thought. View it as a privilege to lead, it's not a privilege to be in charge. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you guys taking time out of your Saturday to come and talk to me. And as always, it was great to see and talk to both of you. And that's it for us. Adios. That's the show. I can't thank you enough for reading, listening, and watching and supporting everything that I've done with 20 Years Done. If you're new to this podcast, I recommend you go to 20yearsdone.com or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/20yearsdone.